You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least, that was the plan. Except now, the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 511 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall with the last episode, William Tecumseh Sherman kicked off the Federals' much-anticipated spring campaign in North Georgia in rather spectacular style as James McPherson's column of Yankees seized Snake Creek Gap to the south of Dalton on May 8th.
The rebel commander, Joe Johnston's attention had been fixed on the Federal threat to Dalton, and so he'd focused on strengthening the Confederate defenses on Rocky Face Ridge and in Crow Valley. As for McPherson, Johnston had guessed he was headed for Rome, Georgia, and so he was completely surprised when McPherson seized Snake Creek Gap, thus threatening the Western and Atlantic Railroad, which was Johnston's all-important line of communication and supply running back down to Atlanta.
However, Johnston caught a break on May 9th when McPherson, marching east from Snake Creek Gap, found Confederate earthworks at Resaca. McPherson didn't know how many rebels were manning those earthworks, and he was also worried about Confederates coming down from Dalton and falling on his left flank. So in the end, rather than pushing ahead and cutting the railroad, McPherson withdrew back into Snake Creek Gap.
By the end of the last episode, it was May 12th, and Sherman had marched most of the rest of his force down to Snake Creek Gap to join McPherson there, while on the Confederate side, Joe Johnston was pulling his troops out of their Dalton defenses along Rocky Face Ridge and in Crow Valley and sending them down to the real point of danger at Resaca.
As Sherman rode southward on May 12th, he thought he was stealing a march on Joe Johnston, and that, as a result, he'd still have a chance to put the rebel commander in a bad spot by pushing out from Snake Creek Gap, taking Resaca, cutting the railroad, and isolating Johnston, who would be left sitting up at Dalton with no good options as to what to do next.
However, on May 13th, when the Federals pushed out from Snake Creek Gap, they ran into stout opposition from advanced Confederate units that delayed the Yankees' march, while the remainder of the rebel army deployed west of Resaca. And so Sherman realized that Joe Johnston hadn't remained sitting up at Dalton, but had instead quickly moved his troops down to the real point of danger at Resaca. In fact, Johnston seemed determined to force a fight at Resaca and contest the Federals' crossing of the Oostenaula River there.
To cover the road and rail bridges at Resaca, Johnston deployed his troops in a line that began at the Oostenaula, west of the town, ran north along the valley of Camp Creek for almost 3 miles, and gradually curved back to the east until its right rested on the Conasauga River.
Polk held the left of this line with the divisions of Canty and Loring.
At the time, Canty was commanding not only his own brigade, but also other troops who had come from the Mobile area to reinforce Johnston in Georgia.
Exactly. Okay, then to the north of Polk, 3 divisions under Hardee held the center of the line. Hood's 3 divisions manned the rebel right.
Hardee's 4th Division, Walkers, took up position at Calhoun to guard the south bank of the Oostenaula against a possible enemy crossing downstream from the Confederate left.
Johnston's position at Resaca had many weaknesses. In fact, it offered no advantage to the rebels and was so untenable that at first Sherman assumed the Confederates would quickly abandon it, since if they were defeated there, they might very well find themselves trapped in the angle formed by the two rivers. In addition, a range of low hills just west of the rebel lines offered good positions from which Federal cannon could fire on the bridges at Resaca. However, the position's most serious weakness was strategic. The Oostenaula's southwesterly course both protected Sherman's right flank and gave the Yankees an opportunity to cross the river downstream and threaten the Western and Atlantic Railroad south of Resaca.
Heavy skirmishing on the 13th soon disabused Sherman of the notion that the Confederates were going to abandon Resaca and continue their retreat. Therefore, as the various Union corps emerged from Snake Creek Gap, Sherman deployed them on a line paralleling that of the Confederates, except that its northern end bent back toward the northwest.
McPherson's soldiers from the Army of the Tennessee led the Federal column as it emerged from Snake Creek Gap, and the formations that followed took up positions to his left. Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, minus 4th Corps, deployed on McPherson's immediate left, with Schofield's men from the Army of the Ohio extending the Federal line on Thomas's left.
4th Corps had directly followed up the retreating Confederates as they came down from Dalton, so it took its place in the Federal line on Schofield's left.
By nightfall on May 13th, Sherman had finished deploying his forces opposite the Confederate position at Resaca. He seems to have hoped that he'd be able to pin down Johnston and hold him at Resaca until the wagons bearing the Federal pontoon equipment caught up and the engineers could bridge the Oostenaula downstream below the Federal right flank. Once that crossing was completed, Sherman planned to send Union cavalry over the river to wreck the railroad south of Calhoun.
Skirmishing erupted at Resaca at first light on the morning of Saturday, May 14th. Sherman also sent Brigadier General Thomas Sweeney's 16th Corps Division down the Oostenaula to search for a crossing site beyond the Federal right flank.
While Sweeney went off to the south to see what he could find, to the north, Sherman ordered a forward wheeling movement by the left end of his long line. However, rough terrain in that area hampered the Federal advance, and the two armies didn't come into close contact there until about noon.
In the afternoon, Union troops from 23rd Corps and 14th Corps assaulted the right center of the Confederate line. They lost heavily and gained no important ground. Then at about 4 p.m., Hood's Confederates counterattacked, striking the Yankees' extreme left, which the Confederates had discovered was up in the air.
Hood's men enjoyed some initial success, but Federal reinforcements rushed from 20th Corps in the Union center stopped the rebel attack. By the time darkness brought an end to the day's fighting, the only significant changes had come at the far southern end of the battle lines. There, some Federal 15th Corps troops had seized a hill from which Union artillery could shell the Resaca bridges. As a consequence of that development, during the night, Confederate engineers laid a pontoon bridge upriver where they hoped it would be beyond the range of the Yankee cannon.
On the 14th, while fighting had flared up along the lines at Resaca, Sweeney had found a promising spot for crossing the Oostenaula near Lay's Ferry, a few miles downstream from the Federals' right flank. There, Snake Creek emptied into the river about 100 yards below the ferry site.
At the site of the ferry, the Oostenaula's right, that is, northern bank, was open, but near the mouth of the creek, heavy woods ran down to the river's edge. A few rebel cavalrymen guarded the ferry crossing. Sweeney put most of his men to making a demonstration in the field opposite the ferry, while his real effort to cross took place at the creek's mouth.
Detachments from 2 Iowa regiments carried pontoon boats down Snake Creek to a concealed spot near the river. Then, at 5 p.m., those boats loaded with soldiers from the 65th Ohio and 85th Ohio pulled out into the river.
Protected by fire from troops on the northern bank, the boats quickly crossed the river and landed on the southern side of the Oostenaula. After firing a few shots, the rebel horsemen fled. But even as that was happening, Sweeney received a report that a large force of Confederates was crossing the river a short distance above Lay's Ferry. Well, logically assuming that this enemy force would attempt to isolate him and destroy his division before he could receive help, Sweeney ordered his men to give up their foothold on the opposite shore and return to the northern bank. Only after the fact did Sweeney find out that the report of Confederates crossing the river was false.
That evening, Joe Johnston learned that the Yankees had crossed the river downstream at Lay's Ferry. The danger that represented to the Western and Atlantic led him to cancel orders he'd issued earlier to renew the assault on the Federal left the next morning.
Instead of renewing the attack on the Federals at Resaca, Johnston instructed Walker to move up from his position at Calhoun and drive the Yankees at the ferry back across the river. However, by the time Walker reached Lay's Ferry, the enemy was gone. While finding no sign of the Federals, Walker posted a small guard, notified Johnston that the reports of an enemy crossing were incorrect, and he returned to Calhoun.
During the night, Sherman decided to push the Confederates at 2 points on the 15th. Ordering Sweeney to cross the river at Lay's Ferry again, Sherman shifted all of 20th Corps to his left center to make an attack there. Meanwhile, Schofield, with the Army of the Ohio, moved to the extreme Federal left.
The redeployment of Hooker's 20th Corps consumed most of the morning on May 15th, and those troops weren't in position to attack until almost noon. Then, when Hooker's 3 divisions did go forward, Hood's Confederates threw them back with little trouble. Only at a small, uncompleted earthen fort in front of Stevenson's division did the attacking Yankees find any success. That little earthwork, held by Captain Max Vandenkorpet's Georgia Battery, quickly became the focus of the fighting in that sector.
Soldiers from several Federal regiments, led by future President Colonel Benjamin Harrison of the 70th Indiana, swarmed over the rebel battery. In bitter hand-to-hand fighting, the Yankees overpowered the Georgians and captured their guns.
However, once in possession of the little fort, the Federals found it open to the rear, and they came under such heavy fire from that direction, from Hood's main line, that they had to quickly abandon their prize. After that, the battery's 4 cannons stood silent between the lines, with neither side able to reach them. After dark, though, the Federals managed to quietly dig away the front of the fort and quietly roll away the guns back to their lines.
That day, as fighting had raged along the lines at Resaca, off to the south, Sweeney and his division prepared to make a second crossing of the Oostenaula.
Sweeney decided he didn't need to reinvent the wheel, so his plan on the 15th was the same one that had worked so well the previous day. But, as often happens in war, events took on a life of their own, when some Federal soldiers found an old flatboat and, on their own initiative, crossed the river unobserved by the rebels. With the Yankees on the southern bank once again the Confederate pickets fled. They carried news to Walker at Calhoun that the Federals were over the Oostenaula at Lay's Ferry, and Walker forwarded that report to Joe Johnston, while he, that is Walker, tried without success to drive Sweeney's Federals back across the river.
At Resaca, Johnston, who had renewed his orders to Hood to counterattack the Federals, now countermanded that order. Unfortunately for the rebels, word of this cancellation didn't reach the extreme right of their line in time to prevent Stuart's division from launching its assault as scheduled.
The Federals repulsed Stuart's attack, inflicting heavy casualties on his men. Meanwhile, when it became clear that Walker couldn't dislodge Sweeney's Yankees from their lodgment at Lay's Ferry, Johnston decided that he had no option but to evacuate Resaca. And so, late in the afternoon, wagons began rolling across the new pontoon bridge, and after dark, the rebel infantry started to withdraw. Hood from the extreme right first, followed by Hardee from the center, and then Polk.
A strong picket line remained behind for several hours to act as a rear guard and keep up firing and generally make enough noise to convince the Yankees that the entire Confederate Army was still present in force. As late as midnight, the rebel pickets repulsed a probe by some Federals from 4th Corps.
Then, at 3:30 on the morning of the 16th, the Confederates set fire to the railroad bridge, and shortly afterward, the last men of the rear guard crossed the river on the pontoon bridge, which was then taken up. But Federals rushed forward in time to capture the road bridge before it could be destroyed.
The operational pattern set in the campaign's first 10 days in May wasn't to change until mid-July. That is, Joe Johnston would concentrate his army, take up a strong position in favorable terrain, strengthen that position with formidable earthworks, and then wait, hoping that Sherman would attack him.
Joe Johnston didn't even try to pry McPherson out of Snake Creek Gap with a quick movement of rebel troops south from Dalton. Even on May 11th and 12th, when most of Sherman's forces were strung out on the roads west of Rocky Face Ridge, trudging south to join McPherson, and only 4th Corps and some Union cavalry remained in front of Mill Creek Gap, Johnston elected to wait passively in his Dalton defenses. Had he acted, or even threatened to act aggressively against 4th Corps on either May 11th or 12th, the potential danger such a move posed might have been enough to bring Sherman hurrying back northward.
Or a quick strikeout from behind Rocky Face Ridge, aiming to wreak havoc upon Sherman's strung-out column, would at least have slowed the Federals' march to join McPherson.
Johnston didn't even wreck the railroad as he retreated from Dalton down to Resaca. Then his counterattacks at Resaca weren't delivered with much force, and he was easily persuaded to call off such efforts. Nor apparently did he ever consider reinforcing Walker for a serious effort to drive back the Federals who crossed the river at Lay's Ferry on May 15th.
In all probability, the Confederates wouldn't have been able to deliver a mortal blow to any part of Sherman's force, but any action at all on Johnston's part would have inflicted losses on the Yankees and thrown a wrench into the Federal commander's operations.
And with the fall elections in the North looming over the start of the spring campaign in Georgia, every casualty inflicted on the Federals and any delays in Sherman's progress would be of benefit to the Confederacy. However, if Joe Johnston continued to simply remain largely passive behind earthworks that Sherman refused to attack and could easily outflank, then there was no way the rebels could achieve success in North Georgia, or even hope to remain in North Georgia for very long.
On the other hand, Sherman had shown in the campaign's opening days that while he might make small-scale attacks on the rebels and jab at their fortifications, he wouldn't make a major full-scale assault. Instead, he would maneuver to outflank the enemy.
However, by rejecting the idea of fighting a big, potentially decisive battle, Sherman was unlikely to achieve anything more than forcing Johnston to withdraw south, where the rebels would take up another position and the dance would begin again. In any case, when he declined to send a strong force through Snake Creek Gap instead of McPherson's weak column, and when he sent Sweeney's lone division to cross the Oostenaula instead of a stronger force, Sherman missed two excellent chances to gain great, if not complete, success at the very beginning of the campaign.
In his book, Atlanta, 1864, Last Chance for the Confederacy, Richard M. McMurray points out that, quote, "Not the least of the ironies of 1864 is the very high probability that if Grant had allowed George Thomas to succeed to command of the military division of the Mississippi by seniority, the 1864 campaign in Georgia would have ended 2 or 3 weeks after its opening in a crushing federal victory that, for all practical purposes, would have ended the war in the West."
That's because it was George Thomas who wanted to send a strong force through Snake Creek Gap to get behind the Confederates at Dalton. And it was Thomas who urged Sherman at Resaca to send a stronger force across the Oostenaula and cut the railroad behind Johnston. Either would have likely led to a smashing success over the rebels' Army of Tennessee and ripped open the way into the heartland of the Confederacy, thus saving many thousands of lives that were instead lost during the last 11 months of the war.
Just as a side note, but on May 15th, the same day Joe Johnston pulled his army out of Resaca, a small but significant battle took place at the little town of Newmarket, up in Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley.
At Newmarket, a ragtag Confederate force, commanded by John C. Breckinridge, routed a column of Federals led by Franz Sigel. Then, with the Shenandoah Valley, at least for the moment, free of danger from the Yankees, most of Breckinridge's victorious rebels were soon moving eastward to reinforce Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in its great struggle against the Army of the Potomac.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Atlanta, 1864, Last Chance for the Confederates by Richard M. McMurray.
As always, you can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is
www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website is information about how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and help support the podcast in that way, just like Dan and Greg P. and Justin W.
and Patrick W. and Jack L. and Casey M.
A big thank you to them. And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.